if you do not have a block labeled glazing, you could use the one that you might have labeled alcohol and just scratch out alcohol and put glazing in that block. Otherwise, you could simply flip your paper over and try it on the back of your paper. What I'm going to have you do is just simply paint 2 leaves. You can paint the leaf in green and then charge a little bit of blue into it. And we're going to put these 2 leaves into our block that says glazing. We're going to come back and glaze one of them, and we're not going to glaze the other. So you'll have a sense of what the difference is when you've glazed something and when you haven't glazed it. And while those leaves are drying, I'm going to demonstrate dry brushing for you. What dry brushing does is it helps you to see the texture on the paper. And the way you want to dry brush is to load your brush with some pigment and then take most of the pigment out. Hold your brush pronated from the top and then drag your brush along the paper. I use this technique a lot when I'm doing wood, if I want to suggest wood grain. And that is dry brushing. Just want to make sure you take most of the pigment off of your brush. If you try to do it with a brush that's too wet, you're not going to get that effect. If your brush is saturated with color, you don't see as much. So the key to dry brushing is to have your brush loaded with pigment and then take most of the pigment out. And you just drag it very lightly across the surface of your paper. I do this a lot too, like on my pears. So I'm just going to demonstrate what Windex does for you. And in that block, we're going to just paint with a fairly rich color. I've got a little pink and a little bit of blue on my brush. And I'm just going to lay the color down onto my paper. Let it dry for a little bit. And then spritz it with a little bit of Windex. And alcohol will give you a very similar look. I mean, if you check it next to the salt, it's pretty similar to what salt does, but they're larger. And you can control the size of these little cells by either putting your Windex into a different bottle or spritzing further away or closer up. So that might be a fun way to get an interesting background into a painting that you were working on. Next, I'm going to demonstrate scraping for you. And I have dry scraping and I have wet scraping. For wet scraping, I like to use the end of a brush that has an angled end. I think you can see that. And once again, we're going to lay our color down fairly rich. And I'll put this into my scraping spot. And then while the pigment is still wet, we can come back and push through. This is a nice way to create a clump of grass. It's pulling and it's lifting. You can use the brush more on the side to scrape out larger shapes. And because I've got so much water and pigment on my paper, it's almost immediately going right back in. But if you let it dry for a little bit and then come back in, you can lift some lighter shapes right into your paper. And that is a wet scrape. See how it's going right down. Now, this is something you want to do at the very end of a painting, because if you're going to scrape your paper, a lot of watercolor paper has sizing right on top. some watercolor papers, I think Gemini paper by Strathmore, they mix the sizing right into the pulp so you can scratch more successfully. But once you've scratched your paper, if you try to come back and paint in that area again, it's going to accept the pigment differently, and you're always going to see the marks from that scratching. So scratching is something that you want to do, or a wet lift is something you want to do, wet scratching, near the end, or at least in an area that you know you're not going to want to come back and work in. It's kind of fun, quick and easy. It looks pretty cool. Dry scraping, I use a razor blade a lot, and I forgot to bring my razor blade in, having one of those mornings. So you can scrape with the side. For dry scraping, you could try scraping with the side of your palette knife. This is done a lot on oceans or lakes to suggest the sparkle of sky, of light coming from the sky onto your body of water. And if you had a razor blade, you could also scrape in some very fine lines as well, if you chose to use this tool and to do it in a dry area rather than a wet area. I'm going to move you forward to the block labeled stencil. In our stencil block, we had put some color and given it a few days to dry. On the opposite side, I'm going to show you a technique you can use, and you might want to use this to create maybe some wallpaper in the background, any type of elements that would be more decorative in your painting. I'm using a little sea sponge, but you could also use a dry brush technique to use a stencil in your watercolor painting. But what I've done is I've dampened the sponge and I've squeezed out the extra water, and I'm going to pick up a little bit of pigment. And with my sponge, I'm going to carefully stencil that shape onto my paper. Now you want to be very mindful when you're doing something like this that you don't have a lot of water, because you have too much water, it'll just get out underneath the stencil. So you want to dampen your sponge and take most of the water out before you apply the pigment to your paper. Definitely don't want too much water. And on the other side of the stencil block, I'm going to demonstrate another tool that's wonderful for lifting. This is a Mr. Clean sponge, and it will take pigment off for you. I'm going to dampen that in the water, take the excess water off, and then you can stamp in the negative. There are lots of stencils that are available in lots of different sizes, and they might be fun to incorporate some of those shapes into a painting that you're doing. If you were doing a floral bouquet, you could have little leaves from a stamp superimposed back behind them. And you can find these little sea sponges in almost any art supply store. And they're not expensive. They're nice to have on hand. Our last demo is going to be our glazing. The wonderful thing about glazing is you can make greens in your paintings. If you're doing an exterior, a landscape, you can glaze your leaves with a very light wash of cadmium yellow. When you're glazing, you want to use very thin color, and you want to paint over an area that's already dry. You don't want too much pigment on your brush, because then you're just going to paint over what's already there. So glazes are very thin washes of color that are laid on top of dry pigment. And putting this little glaze, you can see the difference between this leaf on the left and the one on the right that hasn't been glazed. So if you had a shrub or a floral arrangement and you only glazed some of the leaves, it really gives them effect of being sun-kissed. Another time when artists would glaze, this is not a watercolor, but if I were to take a tomato or pears and glaze over them, it would make it just seem very luminous. The key to glazing successfully is to make it very thin and let it dry. In our last